Have you ever purchased one thing over another because you liked the packaging better? Or what about supporting a cause because you were drawn into the story behind it? Do you instantly and reflexively share new information on a topic because it reinforces your perspective of that topic? Have you ever automatically accepted the information and advice of a health and wellness influencer without fact-checking anything because they said something that sounded like something you already heard before, so it's probably true, and they have a doctorate of some kind, and so everything they say is probably very well researched and accurate, and they sound so smart and have the lifestyle you want to emulate, and a dreamy voice or face or body, and you're pretty sure you'd be best friends because they're just so nice. And now you have a cupboard full of their proprietary blend of supplements and a daily regimen of protocols you probably didn't know you needed until they told you you did. Yeah, me too. What is happening with our decision-making process that we automatically accept some information rather than seeking further intel that would help us make better, more accurate, and well-researched decisions? And what are the conditions that set us up to automatically assume the information we're receiving is true and needs to be accepted and followed? Is it sometimes good that we do this? And when is it not so good? If you want to know, stick with me for the next few minutes and we'll get into it. Hello and welcome to Intro 101. My name is Chris and I am normally your neuroscience and psychology graduate student assistant, but this supplementary series is a bit of a departure from the strictly science basics education you'll find on this channel. But it definitely fits with the ethos of this channel, and that is to help you better interact with the health and wellness information you consume online, as well as with the educators and the influencers dispensing this information. In the next few episodes, I'm going to draw on my education and experiences in marketing communication and psychology to hopefully give you some clarity as to how health and wellness influencers and their teams use certain tactics to leverage the ways we automatically process and categorize information. This is not an uncommon practice. It exists in just about every domain where a person or company wants to gain our trust and loyalty and get us to take a specific action. The thing is, we are rarely aware of when this is happening. For the most part, these tactics tap into different kinds of automatic thinking processes, and sometimes that can leave us vulnerable to all kinds of manipulation. Now, I don't think health and wellness influencers are pacing back and forth in their layers, conjuring up ways to trick us. Not all of them, anyway. These tactics are baked right into most marketing and promotion strategies. So if they're following the advice of a marketing team or business coach, or even tutorials online, they are very likely employing strategies intended to get your attention and keep it and secure your loyalty. And these tactics cleverly appeal to thought processing systems that are at work in the background of our minds. You likely won't know just how unconsciously entangled you are with an influencer's influence. And sadly, the people who are most vulnerable to unconscious influence are those who have serious health anxieties or crises, or have loved ones who do, and they'll do anything to get better or heal the people they love. I've been there, for both myself and for people who were very dear to me. Sometimes we were targeted by influencers who were very well-meaning and truly believed their shtick, however ill-informed they were. And sometimes we were targeted by influencers who most definitely knew better, but tried to sell us garbage anyway because it made them money, and lots of it. To be clear, these tactics are not limited to health and wellness influencers. They emerged from behavioral psychology and behavioral economics research and underlie most marketing and business, even political strategies in general. But I'm going to filter these tactics through the lens of health and wellness because that fits with the intention of this channel. But you can apply this information to a multitude of influencing domains. Okay, so what do I know about marketing and communication strategies? Well, I spent the first half of my adult life working for or in marketing and communication departments for nonprofit and for-profit entities. My first rounds of graduate school included business administration and communication, more specifically, marketing, communication, and donor relations for higher education and charities, as well as health and caregiving related for-profit businesses. I was paid to apply some of these same marketing tactics to bypass your logical thinky brain and appeal to your emotional reactionary brain. And not always for nefarious reasons. Most of the time I was trying to generate compassion for a cause and get people to support that cause. though I will readily admit that some of those causes were horrendously politically charged and abhorrent, and I'm embarrassed at how naive I was about the messaging I was paid to write at the time. But those are stories for another day. I'm telling you my background because I can still recognize, most of the time, these familiar tactics that are used by health and wellness influencers to eventually sell me a product, or an ideology that leads to a product. And slightly less detectable, but most definitely prevalent, are tactics that are used to keep my consistent engagement on income-generating platforms that rely on my engagement. There are well-employed marketing techniques that are intended to take advantage of your unconscious vulnerabilities, like your worldviews, your probability judgments, and your cognitive biases, to get you to take the action that benefits the company or influencer, oftentimes more so than it actually benefits you. We'll get into what these unconscious vulnerabilities are and a bit of the science behind them, but for the most part, this is going to be an informal look at how to assess wellness information and its sources. This first episode will take a broad but contextual sweep through some of those unconscious vulnerabilities. Broadly, there are a few behavioral psychology and behavioral economics concepts that drive so many of our decisions from moment to moment. Many of the tactics used to leverage your automatic thought processing system are based on these concepts, and they will come up throughout this mini-series. So instead of reintroducing you to them in every episode, I thought it would be easier and more efficient use of time to lay them out in one episode, and you can keep coming back to it if you need. Okay, so these behavioral concepts are called schemas, heuristics, and cognitive biases. We'll also briefly look at what logical fallacies are, because they tend to creep into the language of influencing, and language plays a huge role in leveraging your heuristics and biases. You may have heard the terms heuristics and biases pop up a lot recently. I've sure noticed it, especially coming from big, very influential health and wellness accounts that devote considerable effort into dispelling health misinformation, for which I am hugely grateful. And though they've given brief explanations on what heuristics and biases are, I'm going to go a level or two deeper over this mini-series. I'll post links to their content in the show notes below. Before we dive into these concepts, let's first define what I mean by health and wellness educator/influencer. For the purposes of this mini-series, when I say influencer or health and wellness influencer, I mean someone who uses an online platform to dispense health and wellness information with the intent to either eventually or continually build an audience and generate income. They may not call themselves an influencer, but they are either very influential to a large following, or they are trying to build a large following for the purpose of influencing for financial gain. This distinction will get clearer as we get through each episode, but it probably isn't surprising that popularity and money are very strong motivators behind the use of strategic marketing tactics. Popularity is power in online spaces. Follows, likes, shares, retweets, they're all like currency, and most people associate large followings and the blue check marks that symbolize large followings as a sign of influence, celebrity, authority, and some measure of social power. And large accounts are often incentivized, leading to income-generating opportunities. So it's not uncommon for most influencers to use tactics you may not be aware of to draw you into their orbit and keep you there. Sometimes to eventually sell you all kinds of things, and sometimes there are a multitude of other underlying reasons. Now, we'll get into the many different kinds of health and wellness influencers in the next episode, but I just wanted to distinguish what I mean by a health and wellness influencer online from a health professional who may have some influence in our lives in person in the real outside world. More specifically, I want to be clear that I mean a health and wellness influencer online is someone who proselytizes their ideas and information on unregulated, income-generated online platforms where there is no oversight or accountability for the information they dispense, as opposed to a health professional in your real life who works within an institution where there is normally regulatory oversight, peer review, licensure ethics, boards, due diligence, and behavioral accountability. And let me be extra clear, someone can be a licensed or certified health professional or PhD or equivalent in an institution or accountable to an ethics board out in the real world and still be an influencer online who is opportunistic and takes advantage of your vulnerable automatic responses to get you to buy into whatever they're selling, because they can. But we'll get into that more in the next episode. But let's crack on with the behavioral psychology and behavioral economics concepts that will be the scaffolding of this series. The definition of behavioral psychology is probably pretty intuitive. It's the study of behavior through the lens of psychology. So it looks at the many facets of our experiences, including our responses to stimuli in our environment, and how they influence our decisions and behaviors. If you're unfamiliar with what behavioral economics is, it's the study of why humans make certain economic choices and the consequences of those choices. These economic choices are wide-ranging and can be anything from purchasing behavior to financial planning, to charitable giving, to getting university degrees or other qualifications, to selling stuff, and loads more. As a field of study, it's trying to understand why we make the economic choices we make and whether or not they were good or bad choices. And in what ways can we learn to make better choices? Behavioral economics leans heavily on behavioral psychology and emerged when a few prominent behavioral psychologists put the standard economic model to test in situations with high complexity. The standard economic model is largely based on the assumption that when humans make choices, they do so based on unlimited information, unlimited time to evaluate all of that information, and unlimited cognitive capacity to assess the information. And all of these unlimited resources lead to calculated and rational decisions. But here's the kicker. In the 1950s, economist Herbert Simon said, hold up, we don't have any evidence that humans actually behave this way when faced with complex situations. And we should probably take a look at the multitude of limitations we experience when making decisions and create some economic models based on that. We'll get into that more in a minute. But the basic idea is that sometimes we make calculated and rational decisions, and sometimes we don't. There are lots of times when we take numerous mental shortcuts to make estimations and then make a choice based on those estimations. And sometimes the consequences of those estimated choices turn out okay, and sometimes they don't. So behavioral economics works with behavioral psychology to study when we're most likely to use mental shortcuts and when we don't. Those mental shortcuts are named schemas, heuristics, and cognitive biases. Okay, so let's first talk about schemas. The schema theory comes from cognitive psychology by a fella named Jean Piaget. In a nutshell, schemas are a framework we construct over time about the world and the people in it, including ourselves. And we use this to interpret and categorize new information about the world and the people in it. So the moment we're born and begin to experience our environment and interact with people, we feed this framework information about everything we experience and learn and lock it into our long-term memory. The framework eventually helps us make mental shortcuts about new information that is similar or familiar to what is already locked into our framework, so we don't have to evaluate and process every bit of new information that comes into our experience. A simple example of one of many schemas that make up our framework might be how a child develops and categorizes information about animals. A baby may know that a cow has 4 legs and a tail and moves. But when it sees a horse for the first time, they may also think it's a cow and moves until they learn that a horse is a different thing and it makes different noises. They may get to learn firsthand how pets are different from animals in the wild. And if they grow up with a dog instead of a cat, they may grow up to have very strong schemas about dogs versus cats, and they will incorporate that into a broader schema about themselves or other people. They may call themselves a dog person, and that will elicit whatever schema you may have about people who love dogs. If you're a cat person, you may have a very different schema about dog persons. The main point is that from birth onwards, we are organizing and categorizing information into schemas, and we'll keep adding to them and expanding them and evolving them and developing new ones as we are introduced to more and more information. And all of those schemas form our framework from which we filter information about the world and the people in it. Many things contribute to the construction and evolution of our schemas. The way we are raised, like family values and attachment styles, cultural norms, the political ideologies we are most exposed to, the religious ideologies we are most exposed to, or the absence of religion. or even how our parents or others around us behave during a sports game or towards a specific team. We take in all of that information and add it to our own schemas, and we use it as our basis for understanding how the world works and how people behave, and importantly, to inform the judgments we make about the world and others. There are 4 broad types of schemas that make up our framework, and those are person, social, self, and event schemas. I won't get into all of them, but we'll take a second to explore person schemas because they are very relevant to influencing. Person schemas are how we organize information about a specific person, and that might include their personality, their appearance, what they like or dislike, how they behave, what we believe about them, and so on. It can also be what we hope to be true about a person. For example, the person schema you have developed for your favorite health and wellness influencer is going to be different than someone else's person schema for that same influencer, because you are both operating from slightly or vastly different person schemas or frameworks. It will even be different than the schema the influencer has of themselves. Guaranteed, the version of that influencer you have in your head, whom you have filtered through your person schema, doesn't really exist. Parts of that version might, but you have likely taken bits of the highly curated information about themselves that they have posted online or what comes through in an edited interview, and you have organized that information into what you think they should be like according to how you have experienced people who are similar to them in the past, or how you've been taught people like them should be. But unless you are in this influencer's most intimate circle of friends, you do not fully know who they are. And even if you were, it's still probable you still wouldn't know them as well as you think you might, because you'd still be filtering them through your own schemas and projecting all kinds of your understanding of the world onto their business. I'll give you an example I've noticed recently of a wellness influencer who appeared in an interview with a somewhat politically left-leaning interviewer. Some of the influencer's followers were ecstatic that, in their words, their favorite hardcore right-wing wellness guru was taking up space on a liberal platform, while other followers in other spaces have given compelling reasons why this influencer is, in their words, definitely liberal-minded, including his presence in this same interview. What's noteworthy is nothing about that interview was in any way political, but his willingness or intention to be seen by a left-leaning audience has been received by some as a cue that he is bravely facing his liberal enemies, and by others as a cue that he is obviously liberal-friendly. Extra noteworthy is that this influencer himself has stated publicly that he isn't a political person, whatever that means, and really he could have just said that to appease whatever crowd he was talking to at the time. My point is, somewhere along the way, the right-wing hopefuls took cues from things this influencer said to categorize him as politically hardcore right-wing. It was quite likely automatic, while others took cues from things the influencer has said to categorize him as left-leaning politically. There are also likely a number of heuristics and biases at work in both samples that would amplify the automaticity of this categorization, but we'll get into what that means in a minute. But I just want to emphasize that the only discernible truth in this example is that none of them truly know where he lands politically, or know him as well as they think they do. The version of them in their head does not really exist. Their person schema for this influencer is flawed. And I highly suspect that this is what the influencer wants, so he doesn't alienate large groups of followers. I would go as far to say that he was coached to plant those cues in interviews on platforms where their audience were either left or right-leaning, because it's an easy way to gain the trust and following of masses of people when you appear to be like them. And political alignment often generates instantaneous attachment and loyalty. We'll properly get into different biases and heuristics that are also at work in this scenario in a future episode, but this is an excellent example of a person schema at work, and how influencers leverage them to gain your trust and loyalty. As our schemas develop, they become more complex over time, and they can evolve and adapt as our experiences with the world around us change. Cognitive scientists term this evolution, or adaptation, as assimilation and accommodation. When we experience something new, but it still fits into our existing schema, we incorporate or assimilate that information into our schema. The schema itself isn't altered. It's reinforced by the new information. When we experience something new and it changes the way we see the world, or people, or ourselves, we accommodate our schema around the new information by adapting the schema or developing a new schema. So again, schemas are mental shortcuts we use to interpret the world around us. They are automatic for the most part, but here's another kicker. That automaticity can become problematic when it prevents us from accommodating new information. When an event happens that conflicts with our beliefs about a person or group of people, or conflicts with the person's schema we have developed, we tend to search our schemas to create a narrative that fits our beliefs rather than assess the new information for good intel that helps us accommodate our schema. Imagine for a moment the example of the person schema mentioned earlier. What would happen if the hardcore right-wing followers of that influencer and the liberal-minded followers pooled their intel to try to make sense of their influencer? Yeah, I really can't imagine that happening either, but that's my person schema at work. It's also kind of my point. Some schemas are so strong, it's highly unlikely either of those groups of followers are going to concede to the other. Both groups would write off the other's interpretations as false or lies, or keep looking for information to confirm their understanding of the influencer's political views, whichever narrative fits their particular schema. That influencer is banking on that response, quite literally. Confusion almost always benefits the influencer. When information about an influencer emerges that throws your person's schema into chaos, they don't have to do or say anything because they know their followers will create their own self-soothing narrative to stabilize their person's schema and keep their influencer bubble-wrapped in what they want to be true rather than accommodate their schema to fit what could also be true. It's far too much mental effort to shift a well-fed, maybe even overfed person schema. It's much easier to avoid or ignore information to protect the schema. And this is where we transition into heuristics and biases. Heuristics are also mental shortcuts we take to assess and categorize information, but they are different from schemas. Schemas involve the knowledge we have stored in our memory that influence our interpretations of the world and the people in it. Heuristics are rules of thumb we establish to quickly make judgments and decisions and take actions that solve complex problems. We use heuristics so we don't have to constantly assess every detail before making every decision and every step towards an action. It would take an enormous amount of cognitive resources and time if we had to keep stopping to assess what our next step should be. Schemas can influence our heuristics, and likewise heuristics can also influence our schemas. An example of a heuristic is the availability heuristic, and we'll get deeper into different heuristics in upcoming episodes, but the availability heuristic is making a decision or judgment based on how quickly and easily you can recall contextual information related to the judgment you're about to make. So if someone asked me if I was more likely to get torn to shreds by a great white shark or die from a mosquito bite, my availability heuristic immediately assumes horrific death by shark is far more probable because I watched the movie Jaws at too young an age, and the plethora of other shark attack movies and media amplifies the availability of information that confirms this probability. Whereas I've had loads of mosquito bites and I'm still alive, and I've never seen a mosquito attack movie or media. Mosquito death information is less available for me to draw on to make a judgment. But the reality is that the data tells a very different story. Shark attacks are actually very rare, and mosquitoes are responsible for millions of deaths every year. But my available context for either of these situations is what I'm drawing on to make this judgment. I overestimate my risk of annihilation by shark because that event comes easily to mind because of the information available to me. This is my availability heuristic at work. But let's back up a titch and briefly look at the history of heuristics, because knowing their evolution will be helpful for context when they come up throughout this miniseries. Let me first say that heuristics have been widely studied for decades, and it's very unfair of me to try and distill what they are in only a few minutes, but I'm going to try. I'll link papers and books I used to research this episode in the show notes below that you can explore on your own, and I highly recommend that you do. Okay, so heuristics emerged from the work of behavioral scientists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in the 1970s. Their work was inspired by economist Herbert Simon, who I mentioned earlier. If you remember, he was the one who said humans more often than not make complex decisions with limited temporal, mental, and informational resources. He developed a theory related to this called the behavioral model of rational choice. I'm not going to be able to give this model justice in a short amount of time, but just know that he won a Nobel Prize in economics for this model, and it still influences technology today, including artificial intelligence. The gist of this model is that humans operate in bounded rationality, which means we have to make, and do make, decisions with incomplete information within a limited time and with limited cognitive resources. He basically suggested that we are too limited to be able to make rational decisions all the time, so we use shortcuts that help us make do with our limitations. But it wasn't until Kahneman and Tversky's research in the 1970s that this particular trifecta of limitations, information, time, and cognitive resources, was empirically demonstrated and then further developed into a program and a book, and it suggested we process information in two ways: fast thinking and slow thinking. It's more recently known as System 1 and System 2 thinking. According to Kahneman and Tversky, fast or System 1 thinking involves the use of heuristics, so we can take mental shortcuts in order to evaluate limited information quickly with little cognitive effort to make judgments and decisions that, for the most part, turn out okay. But sometimes that method of thinking can leave room for biases to sneak in, and those can lead us astray or can be manipulated by others so that we make irrational decisions or judgments. They suggested that because of this simplification of thought processing and its vulnerability to bias, fast System 1 thinking is often flawed and inaccurate. Slow or System 2 thinking is a much more methodical, thoughtful, calculated, data-driven way of thinking that takes much longer and uses a lot more cognitive energy, but gathers more information and tends to be more accurate. Since they published their book, there have been other dual processing thinking theories that have emerged, and I think it's also important to say that some of the research they used to substantiate their original fast and slow thinking program has not been adequately replicated. And before you slash my tires, Daniel Kahneman fully acknowledged this issue and spent a chunk of his latter years trying to address the replication crisis in scientific research. The theory in broad terms is still quite stable, so it is still widely accepted that we have this fast and slow dual processing tendency. The most notable aspect of the original theory that is a bit wobbly due to difficulties in replication is that Kahneman and Tversky drew a pretty hard line between the two thought processes. Thinking fast means we're going to make inaccurate judgments, or thinking slow means we're going to make accurate judgments. But research emerged that demonstrated we can think fast and still be accurate, and think slow and still be inaccurate. I think this is where schemas could play a significant role, but I haven't looked for data to back that. But put a pin in that anyway. Importantly, Kahneman and Tversky were pretty clear that they believed we could train our fast-thinking processing to be more accurate, so it's probably a little unfair to pigeonhole them with such rigidity. Another disputable aspect of their theory is that originally they believed one or the other thought process was at work at any one time, so you were either thinking fast or thinking slow. But I believe the current consensus among behavioral scientists and economists is that we operate along a continuum of fast and slow, or System 1 and System 2 information processing. The theory is not without its critics, but the main premise still seems to hold true, and that is given limited information, time, and mental resources, we use rules of thumb to take mental shortcuts that help us make estimations that drive our decisions and judgments. These rules of thumb are heuristics and biases. Kahneman and Tversky identified 3 specific heuristics, including the availability heuristic mentioned earlier, but many more have emerged since then. So where do biases come in? Well, biases were an important component of Kahneman and Tversky's fast and slow thinking theory. They believed biases emerged from our heuristics. I think they were the first to coin the term cognitive bias, And like heuristics, biases are also rules of thumb we use to take mental shortcuts, so we can quickly make sense of information. A more technical definition of bias is the systematic deviation of rationality in judgment, meaning biases pull us away from making rational judgments. So heuristics, though they are a mental shortcut, can still potentially lead to accurate judgments, unless we further rely on a bias to make an estimation that leads to a judgment, because that bias has greater potential to draw us away from a rational and accurate judgment. Not all of our biases leave us this vulnerable, but we're just going to look at the ones that pose the greatest risks to our ability to make informed judgments when engaging with health and wellness influencers. Let's put this into context. Let's stick with our influencer who appears to be hardcore right-wing to some followers and liberal-leaning to others. Now let's add the availability heuristic that both sets of followers are likely using to make these judgments about the influencer. The only information that is readily available to them both about the political leaning of this influencer is going to be fed to them from either interviews this influencer has appeared in by people on either side of the political divide, or character endorsements by other influencers they follow. But because both sets of followers are likely locked into algorithms that only feed their political leanings, they will have only been exposed to this influencer on account platforms they have interpreted as either hardcore right-wing for that group of followers or left-leaning for the other group. Now, there is still opportunity within this heuristic for either group to stop and acknowledge that they haven't seen every interview or presentation or speaking engagement this influencer has ever done, and just because the information that is most available to them is all they have accessed doesn't mean it's the only information available. But that takes mental effort and commitment to seek out other information that might turn out to be uncomfortable and disrupt the person schema they really want to be true. So what can happen, and often does happen, is we double down on our mental shortcuts and let a bias sneak in. And one of the most common cognitive biases that none of us are immune to is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when we look for information that confirms our understanding of something and ignores information that would otherwise disconfirm it. So in this example, we have the perfect setup for confirmation bias. Both groups of followers will reinforce their availability heuristic by searching for information that confirms what they believe to be true. The righties will search for cues that confirm he's hardcore right-wing and be blind to anything that counters that perception. And the lefties will search for cues that confirm his leftness. This bias prevents them from looking for alternative information and also blinds them from seeing alternative information if it were presented. It prevents them from registering new alternative information which they could use to accommodate their person's schema. I suspect schemas can also make it difficult to know what to do with information that doesn't fit into our current schemas. We can't automatically organize information we don't recognize. It's harder to accommodate new information than it is to assimilate information into an existing schema. But do you see how easy it would be for an influencer to milk that bias to keep you tethered to their content? They could tell you anything you want to hear. There's always a study that sort of supports anything you want to be true. I mean, not really if you know how to read and interpret data, but they know you're not going to take the mental effort to fact check them because your confirmation bias has already automatically decided that they're right, that the information in your mind is true because it fits the narrative you want to be true. It fits your bias and schema, so you're going to automatically accept it. Anyway, there are a lot more cognitive biases than confirmation bias. Kahneman and Tversky first identified, I think, 12 biases, but others have contributed many more. I think at present there may be 200 biases that have been identified. We're not going to look at all of them in this mini-series, but we will look at the ones that are most relevant to health and wellness influencing. Okay, so we're almost at the end of this episode, but I just wanted to mention logical fallacies and what they are because they are a mechanism of argument that can create all kinds of confusion. Logical fallacies are when someone introduces invalid or faulty reasoning to make irrelevant and unsupported points, usually in an argument or debate, but in the influencing world, it seems to be growing in prevalence with the popularity of certain social media short formats. But I think equally rife with logical fallacies is the health and wellness podcast world. Logical fallacies seem like really strong arguments, but they are deceptively full of nonsense. One example of a logical fallacy is the hasty generalization fallacy. And this is when someone draws wildly broad conclusions about something without supporting its validity with adequate evidence, or uses only the evidence that supports it without also introducing or even looking for evidence that doesn't. Another logical fallacy is the appeal to authority fallacy. And this happens when someone or a group of people rely too heavily on the opinion of one person, especially if it's outside the other people's expertise. There are layers to this one, but let's put both examples into context. You're scrolling through social media shorts, and an influencer you have decided to trust posts a short from an interview with a doctor of some kind, but it's not clear what kind. But the music is broody and a little scary, and he's using big sciencey words like mechanism and interleukin-1, and sort of mentions a study but doesn't cite it. But you don't have time to think about that because words like sugar and death and cardiovascular disease are flashing. And then there's a dramatic pause, and punctuated by eerie background silence, his last words ring in your ears. Sugar will kill you, but eating an 8-ounce steak every day will save your life, up your testosterone levels, and keep you virile well until your 90s. I don't know if anyone has ever actually said that, but shorts are full of these kinds of sciencey word salads leading up to wildly broad conclusions that are poorly supported, the hasty generalization fallacy, but they're given credence because they come from seemingly credentialed people, and it was further supported by that influencer endorsing them, though it's well outside that influencer's professional purview, the appeal to authority fallacy. You might be saying, well, it's just a short and that can be taken out of context. Yeah, it can. It can also go viral, and our propensity to take mental shortcuts makes short format posts super appealing to our fast System 1 thought processing. Once that short takes off and gets 30 million views, it is impossible to rein that claim back in and parse the accurate from the nonsense and re-educate for accuracy. So over the next few episodes, we're going to get familiar with our fast System 1 thought processing mental shortcuts, how they can be and are leveraged by influencers without our awareness to get us to take actions they want us to take. And I'm not just going to leave you hanging there. I'm going to give you some suggestions on how you can practice becoming more aware of them, and what tactics of your own you can implement to resist and or reduce judgment errors due to hijacked mental shortcuts, some of which you can transpose and use beyond health and wellness influencers. Now, there is some evidence in medical diagnosis error studies that suggest that awareness of your heuristics and biases alone may not be enough to protect you from making judgment errors. But taking a structured approach to information retrieval and reorganization does appear to have a preventative effect on judgment error. In these studies, post-diagnostic reflection strategies helped. So we'll look at some reflection strategies that may be helpful immediately after short and long format content consumption. But I'm also going to suggest preemptive strategies before you start scrolling or listening or watching health and wellness influencers that may anchor and temper your automatic System 1 thought processing, so you'll be more receptive to reflection after information consumption. I also wanted to gently warn you that at first some of the information in this supplemental series might feel a bit stingy. None of us likes to feel like we're being duped or misled, or that we're even capable of not knowing ourselves well enough to know when it's happening. I just want to reiterate that we are all subject to heuristics and biases. No one is immune. So if you feel reactionary resistance bubble up while you listen to these episodes, consider that good intel. That's an excellent signal for you to stop and explore and assess any information you feel is being challenged. You may be experiencing bias, or the information just may not apply to your experience, or maybe the information needs more context before you can make a judgment. Take a minute to figure it out. It will take some mental effort, but as you practice becoming aware of resistance and reflecting on it, it can become a more automatic practice that will help you in the long run. We can learn to use our fast thinking system to signal to us when we need to take a minute to gather more intel to make a more accurate judgment. I also want to be careful and clear that I'm not proposing that anything I suggest in this series is going to be a quick fix to a systemic problem in science and health and wellness communication. Even after being educated in how these tactics work and using them in my profession, when I was anxious and fearful about my own health, I automatically bypassed the thought processing system that stews in logic. Now, I had used these tactics in very different nonprofit and for-profit industries, so I didn't think to evaluate health and wellness information through the same lens, and it cost me a lot. I was very easily swayed and impulsive about my health choices. I spent more money than I had on supplements and online health and nutrition advice, and it still left me in staggering despair. I was no better off than when I had started looking for answers to my health issues. And in many ways, I was worse. That's not going to be everyone's experience. But if you can relate, or if someone you know can relate, I can tell you now that some mental and emotional preparation and education before you begin looking for answers from influencers, or listening to their podcasts, or watching their YouTube channels, or scrolling through their social media content, and some reflection afterward, can go a long way in safeguarding you from making inaccurate, impulsive judgments, and then further evangelizing those judgments to others. It's going to take a minute, but the more you know what to look out for, and the more you practice looking for it, the sooner it can become part of a faster, more accurate response. Okay, so that's it for this episode. Thanks for being here. Please check out the STEM education organizations in the show notes and support them in any way that you can. Until next time, take care out there.